They told me I was too smart for revenge, that intelligent people rise above it, take the high road, be the bigger person. My therapist said it, my friends said it, hell, even my own mother said it when I told her what Marcus had done to me. You're better than that, she whispered over the phone, her voice dripping with that patronizing tone that makes your skin crawl. But here's what nobody tells you about being the smart one, the rational one, the one who always thinks before they act. Sometimes thinking is exactly what makes the revenge so much worse. I used to believe that garbage about intelligence and restraint going hand in hand. For 32 years, I lived by that philosophy. Master's in psychology, PhD in behavioral sciences, published researcher, who spent her days analyzing why people do terrible things to each other. I was the expert on human motivation, the one colleagues came to when they needed to understand the darker corners of the human psyche. Marcus knew this about me when he walked into my life 6 months ago. He knew I was the type who analyzed every angle, who believed in justice systems and proper channels, and doing things the right way. What he didn't know was that all that knowledge about human behavior, it works both ways. Marcus was my research partner at the university. Brilliant, charming, the kind of man who could make you forget your own name when he smiled at you across a conference table. We were working on a groundbreaking study about manipulation tactics in intimate relationships. Ironic, considering what was about to happen. For 4 months, we spent 18-hour days together, analyzing data, writing papers, building something that could have changed how we understand emotional abuse. He was attentive, supportive, always there with coffee when I needed it, and encouragement when the research got overwhelming. When he started flirting, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. The first red flag should have been how quickly he isolated me from the rest of the research team. We work so well together, he'd say, convincing me to skip group meetings, to handle communications with our subjects privately. Why dilute perfection? God, I was so stupid. Here I was, literally studying manipulation tactics, and I couldn't see them being used on me. Or maybe I could see them, but I wanted so badly to believe that someone could want me for me, not for what I could give them. You know that feeling when you're watching a horror movie, and you're screaming at the character not to go into the basement? That's what my rational mind was doing to my emotional mind for weeks. But smart people, we're really good at justifying things, aren't we? Every strange behavior, every boundary he crossed, every time he made me feel small. I had a psychological explanation for it. Stress from his divorce, pressure from his department, childhood trauma manifesting in adult relationships. I turned myself into his personal therapist instead of recognizing what he really was. A predator who had found the perfect victim. Someone who would analyze his behavior instead of trusting her gut. Someone who would make excuses for him because she understood the complex psychology behind manipulation. Someone who would never, ever fight back because she was too evolved for something as primitive as revenge. The night everything changed started like any other. We were in my office, going over the final data for our paper. The one that was supposed to make both our careers. The one that represented 2 years of my life, my research, my innovative methodology that he couldn't have developed without me. I remember feeling so proud, so accomplished, watching him scroll through the pages on my computer. This is incredible, he said, and I felt that warm glow of validation. We're going to change everything. Then he stood up, kissed me gently on the forehead, and said he needed to run home to grab something. He'd be back in an hour to celebrate properly. I should have known something was wrong when my computer started acting strange 20 minutes later. Files corrupting, programs crashing, but I was too tired to think clearly. I just wanted to save our work and go home. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized what had happened. Marcus had installed malware on my system, sophisticated enough that it took our IT department 3 days to figure out what he'd done. He had copied everything, every file, every piece of data, every innovative methodology I'd developed. And while I was dealing with the computer crisis, he was across town, submitting our research to the American Journal of Psychology, under his name only. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. 2 years of work, stolen in 20 minutes. My methodology, my insights, my career-defining research. All of it now belonged to Marcus Chen, brilliant researcher and manipulative sociopath. When I confronted him, he didn't even bother to deny it, just looked at me with those dead eyes and said, "You should have been more careful with your passwords." Then he smiled, that same charming smile that had made me fall for him in the first place. "Besides, who's going to believe you? You're the one who gave me access to everything. You're the one who invited me into your office every night. This looks like a collaboration that went bad because you caught feelings. I went through all the proper channels first, because that's what smart people do, right? Filed complaints with the university, contacted the journal, tried to prove the work was mine. But Marcus had been clever about it. He'd been documenting our collaboration for months, sending himself emails about his ideas, creating a paper trail that made it look like we'd been equal partners who'd had a falling out. And the cherry on top, he'd been recording our conversations in my office. Not the personal ones, of course, just the professional discussions where I'd walked him through my methodology, explained my thinking, helped him understand the research. All perfectly legal, all perfectly damning. The university's ethics committee spent 3 weeks investigating and came back with a decision that made me want to scream. Insufficient evidence of misconduct. They recommended we work out our professional differences privately. The journal editor, a colleague of Marcus's mentor, suggested I should be more careful about protecting my work in the future, and implied that maybe I should consider whether I was really ready for this level of academic pressure. By the time I finished fighting through official channels, Marcus had already presented our research at 2 major conferences. He had been offered a department head position at Stanford, and was being hailed as a rising star in psychological research. That's when I realized something that my years of studying human behavior had somehow missed. The system isn't designed to protect the intelligent, rational people who follow the rules. It's designed to protect the clever, ruthless people who know how to manipulate those rules. Marcus hadn't just stolen my research. He'd stolen it in a way that made me look like a bitter, jealous colleague who couldn't handle being outmaneuvered. Every time I tried to fight back through proper channels, I looked more desperate, more unreliable, more like exactly the kind of person who would make false accusations because she couldn't handle being rejected. But here's the thing about being really, truly intelligent. Eventually, you stop trying to solve the problem the way you're supposed to, and you start solving it the way it needs to be solved. The first thing I did was stop crying. I know that sounds simple, but it's not. When you've been violated the way I had been, when someone has reached into your life and torn out the thing you're most proud of, crying feels like the only sane response. But crying meant I was still thinking like a victim. And victims don't get justice. They get sympathy, maybe, if they're lucky. But justice? Justice requires a different kind of thinking entirely. I started studying Marcus the way I'd studied my research subjects. Methodically, obsessively, with the kind of clinical detachment that had made me good at my job in the first place. I pulled up every paper he'd ever published, every presentation he'd given, every interview he'd done. I analyzed his patterns, his weaknesses, his tells, and what I found was fascinating. Marcus wasn't just a thief. He was a serial thief, an academic parasite who had built his entire career on other people's work. The Stanford position he'd been offered, it was based on research he'd collaborated on with a graduate student named Jennifer Walsh 3 years ago. Jennifer, who had mysteriously left the program just before the paper was published. Jennifer, who had never worked in academia again. I found her working as a data analyst at a tech company in Austin. And when I called her, the silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. "He did it to you too," she whispered finally. I tried to fight it, but no one believed me. He made me look crazy. There were others. Dr. Sarah Kim, whose innovative therapy techniques had somehow become Marcus's signature approach. Professor David Reeves, whose breakthrough study on cognitive dissonance had launched Marcus's early career. Graduate students, junior faculty, research assistants, a trail of brilliant minds who had trusted Marcus and paid the price. All of them following the same pattern: isolation, manipulation, theft, and then character assassination if they tried to fight back. The man was a psychological vampire, feeding off other people's intellect and creativity while convincing the world he was the genius. But here's what Marcus hadn't counted on. All of his victims had been good people, honest people. People who fought fair and followed rules and believed in justice. People who, when they lost, accepted defeat and moved on with their lives. I wasn't good people anymore. The night Marcus stole my work, he killed the version of me that believed in fairness and proper channels and taking the high road. What was left was something much more dangerous. A behavioral psychologist with nothing left to lose and a very specific skill set. I spent 3 weeks building psychological profiles of everyone in Marcus's life. His department head, his mentor, his colleagues, his ex-wife, his new girlfriend. I studied them like lab rats, learning their motivations, their fears, their pressure points. I found out that his department head was terrified of scandal because his own tenure was shaky. His mentor was paranoid about his legacy being tarnished by association. His colleagues were jealous of his rapid rise and looking for reasons to tear him down. His ex-wife was still bitter about their divorce and their ongoing custody battle. His new girlfriend was an ambitious graduate student who had no idea about his history. The beautiful thing about understanding human psychology is that you don't need to destroy someone yourself. You just need to create the conditions where they destroy themselves. Marcus had built his career on lies, but lies are fragile things. They require constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant energy to keep them intact. All I had to do was find the right pressure points and push. I started with his ex-wife, Sarah. A quick look at her social media showed me everything I needed to know. She was already suspicious about his finances, wondering how he could afford his new lifestyle on a professor's salary. One anonymous tip about his consulting work that he'd never declared to the IRS, complete with fabricated evidence that looked perfectly legitimate. And suddenly, Marcus was dealing with a very thorough audit. Not illegal, just thorough. The kind of audit that requires you to account for every penny you've earned for the past 5 years. While he was dealing with that stress, I reached out to his new girlfriend, Amy. Not directly, of course. I created a fake Facebook profile, posed as a concerned former colleague, and started a conversation about research ethics. I shared some troubling stories I'd heard about professors who exploited graduate students. I mentioned casually that she should be careful about sharing her work with her advisor. I even sent her a link to an article about academic plagiarism, with a note that said, "This reminded me of something I heard about your department. Probably nothing, but thought you should know." Amy was smart. Smarter than I'd been, apparently. She started asking Marcus questions about his research, about his methods, about his sources. She started paying attention to things that didn't add up. And Marcus, who was already stressed about the audit and the custody battle and the university's sudden interest in his consulting work, started making mistakes. He got defensive when she asked about his work. He got angry when she pushed for details. He started treating her the way he'd treated me, with that condescending tone that made her feel small and stupid for asking questions. But Amy wasn't isolated the way I had been. She had friends, colleagues, mentors who saw the change in her. When she started crying in the department bathroom, people noticed. When she started missing classes, professors asked questions. When she finally broke down and told her thesis advisor about Marcus's behavior, she had a support system ready to catch her. A support system that included some very influential people who had been looking for reasons to take Marcus down a peg. The third pressure point was his mentor, Dr. Patricia Wilkins, a woman who had built her career on integrity and was absolutely terrified of being associated with any kind of scandal. I didn't need to lie to her, I just needed to tell her the truth. About Jennifer Walsh, about Dr. Kim, about Professor Reeves, about me. I presented it as a concerned colleague sharing troubling information, backing up every claim with evidence that was publicly available if you knew where to look. Dr. Wilkins was smart enough to realize that if this information was out there, other people would find it eventually. And when they did, her association with Marcus would be scrutinized. Her endorsement of his work would be questioned. Her own reputation would be damaged by proxy. So she did what any rational person would do. She started distancing herself from Marcus, quietly but decisively. When the university's review board suddenly decided to take another look at Marcus's recent publications, it wasn't because I'd filed another complaint. It was because Dr. Wilkins had quietly suggested that, given the current focus on research integrity, they might want to be extra careful about high-profile cases. When the journal editor received anonymous tips about similarities between Marcus's work and unpublished research by several other academics, it wasn't because I'd contacted them directly. It was because their own fact-checkers had been doing more thorough background research lately. The beautiful thing about psychological manipulation is that when it's done right, the targets do most of the work themselves. Marcus's world wasn't falling apart because I was attacking it directly. It was falling apart because the lies he'd built it on couldn't withstand the kind of scrutiny they were suddenly receiving. And every time he tried to fight back, every time he got defensive or angry or tried to discredit his accusers, he just made himself look more guilty. The IRS audit revealed that Marcus had been underreporting his consulting income for years. The university investigation found troubling similarities between his work and research conducted by several other academics. His ex-wife's custody lawyer used his financial problems and the ethics investigation to argue that he was an unstable influence on their children. His new girlfriend broke up with him publicly, citing his manipulative behavior and academic dishonesty. His mentor stopped returning his calls. His colleagues started avoiding him in the hallways. But I wasn't done, because Marcus hadn't just stolen my work, he'd made me doubt myself, made me question my own sanity, made me feel like I was crazy for thinking I deserved better. He'd used his charm and his intelligence to make me complicit in my own destruction. And for that, he deserved something special. The Stanford offer disappeared first. Not with fanfare or explanation, just a quiet phone call letting Marcus know that they had decided to go in a different direction. The research conferences started declining his applications. The journals that had once competed for his submissions began finding flaws in his methodology. His consulting clients, concerned about the ethics investigation, terminated their contracts. In the space of 6 weeks, Marcus Chen went from rising star to academic pariah. But watching him fall wasn't enough. I needed him to understand what he had done to me, to really feel the same helplessness and betrayal that I had felt. And that's when I remembered something from my research on psychological trauma. The worst damage isn't always the original attack. It's the moment when the victim realizes that no one believes them, no one will help them, and they are completely alone. I had been building Marcus's prison for months, but I hadn't told him I was the architect. He thought his world was falling apart due to bad luck, increased scrutiny, unfortunate timing. He had no idea that every pressure point, every investigation, every loss was connected to the woman he had dismissed as too smart for revenge. He thought he was dealing with random misfortune, not orchestrated destruction. That's when I decided to reveal myself. Not all at once, and not in a way that would implicate me legally. I wanted him to figure it out slowly, the way I had figured out what he had done to me. I wanted him to feel that same growing horror as the pieces fell into place. It started with small things. I sent him articles about academic plagiarism from an anonymous email account, with subject lines like, "Thought you might find this interesting." I left printouts of Jennifer Walsh's original research on his desk, with no note or explanation. I created a fake LinkedIn profile for Dr. Sarah Kim and sent him a connection request, with a message that said, "Funny how our work ended up being so similar. Small world, isn't it?" Marcus was smart enough to know these weren't coincidences, but he couldn't figure out the pattern. He started looking over his shoulder, checking his office for bugs, asking colleagues if they'd noticed anything strange. The paranoia was delicious to watch, but it wasn't enough. I needed him to know that I knew. I needed him to understand that his brilliant plan had been seen through by someone even smarter. The final reveal came during the university's ethics hearing. Marcus had demanded a formal investigation, confident that he could charm his way out of trouble the way he always had. He hired a lawyer, prepared character witnesses, gathered evidence of his stellar reputation. He walked into that hearing room like a man who owned the world. I was there as a witness, of course, the victim giving her side of the story. Marcus's lawyer had prepped him for this. They'd paint me as a scorned colleague, maybe hint that I'd been romantically interested and was acting out of jealousy. Standard playbook for discrediting female accusers in academic settings. Marcus sat there with that familiar smug expression, ready to watch me destroy myself with my own emotions. But I didn't play the victim. Instead, I played the expert. I presented my case like a research paper, complete with methodology, evidence, and conclusions. I walked the committee through Marcus's pattern of behavior, using every piece of documentation I'd gathered over months of investigation. I showed them how he had systematically targeted vulnerable colleagues, how he had perfected his manipulation techniques, how he had covered his tracks to avoid consequences. And then I did something Marcus wasn't expecting. I thanked him. "Professor Chen's behavior toward me was devastating," I said, looking directly at him for the first time since entering the room. "But it also taught me something valuable about the difference between intelligence and wisdom. Intelligence is knowing how to manipulate people, how to exploit their trust, how to steal their work without leaving obvious fingerprints. But wisdom is understanding that every action has consequences, even if those consequences take time to manifest." I saw the exact moment when Marcus realized what I was saying. His face went pale, his confident posture crumbled, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. You see, I continued, Professor Chen made one crucial miscalculation. He assumed that because I was intelligent, I would be predictable. He thought he understood how smart people respond to betrayal, with hurt feelings, formal complaints, appeals to authority. He never considered that intelligence, when properly motivated, can be far more dangerous than he imagined. The committee was hanging on every word, but I only cared about Marcus's reaction. I watched him do the math, piece together all the strange events of the past few months, realize that every disaster in his life had been carefully orchestrated by the woman he dismissed as too evolved for revenge. The beautiful thing about studying human behavior, I said, my voice steady and professional, is that you learn how people really work, not how they say they work, not how they want to work, but how they actually respond when they're under pressure. Professor Chen taught me that lesson better than any textbook ever could. After the hearing, Marcus cornered me in the parking lot. He was shaking with rage, but also with something else, fear. You destroyed my life, he hissed. Over what? A research paper? You ruined everything I worked for because your feelings got hurt. I looked at him calmly. I didn't destroy your life, Marcus. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own actions. All those lies you told, all those people you hurt, all those shortcuts you took, I didn't create any of that. I just made sure it caught up with you. No one will believe you orchestrated this, he said desperately. I'll tell them you're crazy, that you've been stalking me, that you fabricated evidence. I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. Go ahead, tell them. Show them the anonymous emails, the suspicious coincidences, the perfectly timed revelations. Try to convince them that a heartbroken colleague somehow manipulated the IRS, the university administration, your ex-wife's lawyers, your girlfriend's friends, and 3 different academic journals into investigating you simultaneously. Try to explain how I managed to fabricate evidence that multiple independent sources verified. Try to make them believe that all of this was an elaborate revenge plot, instead of the natural consequences of your own choices. Marcus stared at me, and I could see him running through the possibilities in his head. Every angle he'd considered, every explanation he could offer, every defense he could mount, they all made him sound paranoid and delusional. I had been careful to work within existing systems, to use information that was already available, to simply shine light on things he had tried to keep hidden. There was no smoking gun pointing back to me. No clear evidence of orchestration that couldn't be explained by coincidence and increased scrutiny. You can't prove I did anything wrong, I said softly. Just like I couldn't prove what you did to me. The difference is, I don't need anyone to believe me. The results speak for themselves. That's when Marcus broke, really broke. Started crying right there in the parking lot, talking about how unfair it all was. How he'd made mistakes, but everyone makes mistakes. How his career was over and his family was gone and his life was ruined. It was pathetic and satisfying and deeply uncomfortable all at once. You want to know the real difference between smart people and everyone else? I asked him as he sobbed. Smart people understand that intelligence without integrity is just sophisticated stupidity. You were so proud of being clever, Marcus, but you were never actually smart. I left him there in the parking lot and drove home to my apartment, where I spent the evening doing something I hadn't done in months. Working on my research, my real research, the work I'd been too consumed with revenge to focus on. Because that's the thing about justice, it's not an end in itself, it's just clearing the way for what comes next. The ethics committee's final decision came 3 weeks later, complete vindication for me, complete condemnation for Marcus. Not only did they find him guilty of academic misconduct, but they recommended that his previous publications be reviewed for similar violations. The university terminated his employment immediately. The psychology licensing board opened their own investigation. His doctoral degree was under review. But the most satisfying part wasn't the official sanctions. It was watching Marcus try to explain what had happened to him. He started telling people that I had orchestrated an elaborate revenge plot, that I had somehow manipulated multiple institutions and individuals into attacking him simultaneously. The more he talked about it, the crazier he sounded. People who might have been sympathetic to his situation started backing away, convinced that he was having some kind of psychological breakdown. The beautiful irony was that Marcus was telling the truth, but the truth was so improbable that it sounded like a paranoid delusion. I had orchestrated his downfall, But I'd done it so carefully, so subtly, so systematically that proving it would require the kind of evidence that simply didn't exist. Every action I'd taken had been defensible, every contact I'd made had been legitimate, every piece of information I'd shared had been accurate. I had played the game perfectly within the rules, while Marcus had spent years breaking them. Dr. Patricia Wilkins reached out to me personally to apologize for not seeing Marcus's pattern of behavior sooner. "I should have known," she said, during our coffee meeting. "The signs were all there. I was just so impressed by his productivity that I didn't question where all that innovation was coming from." "That's how predators work," I told her. "They're very good at showing you what you want to see." Marcus knew you valued prolific research, so he gave you prolific research. He just didn't mention where he was getting it. Dr. Wilkins nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about our conversation a lot, about the other victims you mentioned. Have you been in touch with them?" I had been, actually. Jennifer Walsh, Dr. Sarah Kim, Professor David Reeves. All of them had reached out to me after news of Marcus's downfall spread through academic circles. They wanted to know how I'd done it, how I'd succeeded where they had failed. The answer was simple. I'd stopped trying to be the better person. "They're good people," I told Dr. Wilkins. "They did what they were supposed to do. They followed the rules, trusted the system, believed that truth and justice would prevail, and they were punished for it." "And you?" Dr. Wilkins asked. "What made you different?" I thought about that question for a long time. What had made me different? Was it the psychological training that helped me understand Marcus's weaknesses? Was it the research skills that let me gather evidence so effectively? Was it just luck that I'd caught him at a moment when his other lies were starting to unravel? "I stopped caring about being right," I said finally. "I started caring about being effective." That conversation haunted me for weeks, because Dr. Wilkins had touched on something I'd been trying not to think about. What had I become in my quest for justice? I'd started this journey as a victim seeking fairness, but somewhere along the way, I'd transformed into something else entirely. Something calculating and ruthless and frighteningly competent at psychological manipulation. I'd proven that smart people could get revenge, but in doing so, had I proven that smart people shouldn't? The question became more urgent when I started getting contacted by other victims. Not just Marcus's victims, but people who'd heard about what I'd done and wanted my help with their own situations. A graduate student whose advisor had sexually harassed her. A junior professor whose department head was stealing credit for her work. A researcher whose lab partner had sabotaged her experiments. They all had the same story. They'd tried the proper channels, filed the right complaints, followed the correct procedures, and they'd all been ignored, dismissed, or punished for speaking up. Now they wanted to know if I could help them get the justice they deserved. "I'm not a vigilante," I told the first few callers. "What happened with Marcus was personal. I can't just go around destroying people's careers." But they kept calling, and the more stories I heard, the more I realized that Marcus wasn't an aberration. He was just one example of a much larger problem. A system that rewards predators and punishes victims, as long as the predators are smart enough to manipulate the system effectively. The graduate student who'd been harassed, her advisor was up for tenure and had the full support of the department. The professor whose work was being stolen, her department head was bringing in millions in grant money. The researcher whose experiments were being sabotaged, her lab partner was the son of a major donor. In every case, the victim had less power than the perpetrator. In every case, the system was designed to protect the status quo. In every case, following the rules meant accepting injustice. I started small, just advice mostly: how to document harassment properly, how to build a case that couldn't be dismissed, how to identify allies and pressure points. I told myself I was just sharing knowledge, not actively participating in revenge plots. But knowledge is power, and power is never neutral. The graduate student used my advice to expose her advisor's pattern of harassment, leading to his resignation and criminal charges. The professor built such a strong case against her department head that the university had to act, resulting in his demotion and the restoration of her stolen research. The researcher gathered enough evidence of sabotage to get her lab partner expelled and blacklisted from academic programs. Each success felt like validation. Each victory proved that the system could be made to work, if you understood it well enough and pushed the right buttons in the right sequence. I wasn't being a vigilante, I was being a consultant, helping people navigate a broken system more effectively. But systems have a way of pushing back when you challenge them to successfully. The first warning came from my own department head. Dr. Robert Chen. No relation to Marcus, just an unfortunate coincidence that made the conversation more awkward than it needed to be. I've been hearing some interesting rumors about you, he said, during what was supposed to be a routine check-in meeting. People are saying you've become some kind of guru for disgruntled academics, that you're helping people wage war against their colleagues. I'm sharing knowledge about how institutions work, I said carefully. That's not warfare, that's education. Dr. Chen leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of clinical interest I usually reserve for my research subjects. You know, I've been following your situation with Marcus with great interest. Very impressive work. The way you handled that, very thorough. The way he said thorough made my skin crawl. It was the tone you'd use to compliment someone on a particularly elegant assassination. Marcus was stealing research, I said. I simply ensured that the appropriate authorities had access to accurate information about his conduct. Of course, Dr. Chen nodded. Very appropriate. Very proper. The kind of response we'd expect from someone with your training and expertise. There was a long pause. Then he leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. But here's the thing about being very good at something, he said. Eventually, people start to notice. And when people start to notice that you're very good at destroying careers, they start to wonder if their own career might be next. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Dr. Chen wasn't just warning me about rumors, he was warning me about consequences. The same system that had failed to protect me from Marcus was now viewing me as a potential threat. I'm not destroying anyone's career, I said. I'm helping people protect themselves from those who would. Semantics. Dr. Chen waved dismissively. The result is the same. Colleagues are nervous. Administrators are asking questions. People are wondering if you've become unstable. And there it was, the same weapon that had been used against Marcus, now being prepared for use against me. If I kept helping victims get justice, I would be painted as a vindictive troublemaker who couldn't be trusted. My own career would be destroyed, not through dramatic misconduct, but through quiet whispers and gradual isolation. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked. Dr. Chen smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm suggesting that you might want to consider focusing on your own research for a while. Put some distance between yourself and these consulting activities. Let things settle down. And if I don't, the smile disappeared entirely. Then you might find that people start asking uncomfortable questions about your methods, about how you gathered all that information on Marcus, about whether your approach to problem solving is compatible with our institutional values. I left that meeting with a new understanding of my situation. I had won the battle against Marcus, but in doing so, I had revealed capabilities that made the system itself nervous. Smart people weren't supposed to get revenge, not because they were above it, but because when they did, they were too good at it. The system could tolerate individual predators like Marcus because they operated within acceptable parameters. The aftermath of Dr. Chen's downfall taught me something crucial about the difference between revenge and justice. When I destroyed Marcus, it felt personal, satisfying, like scratching an itch that had been driving me crazy for months. But when I exposed Dr. Chen's corruption, it felt different. It felt clean, professional, like I was finally using my skills for their intended purpose. The distinction mattered more than I initially realized. Revenge is about settling scores, about making someone pay for what they did to you personally. Justice is about preventing harm, about protecting future victims, about making systems work the way they're supposed to work. The methods might look similar from the outside, but the motivation and the scope are completely different. I started getting even more calls after the Dr. Chen story broke, but now they weren't just from individual victims looking for help with personal grievances. I was hearing from whistleblowers, journalists, advocacy groups, even federal investigators who needed help understanding complex institutional dynamics. My reputation had evolved from woman who got revenge on her ex-colleague to expert on academic corruption and institutional manipulation. The university offered me a promotion, department head of a new office focused on research integrity and institutional ethics. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were essentially asking me to formalize and legitimize the work I'd been doing informally, to turn my revenge skills into official policy. I accepted the position, but with conditions. I wanted full authority to investigate any allegations of misconduct, regardless of who was involved. I wanted direct reporting relationships to the board of trustees, not through the administration. and I wanted protection for anyone who came forward with information about institutional problems. You're asking for a lot of independence, the provost said during our negotiation meeting. This kind of authority could be disruptive. Good, I replied. Disruption is exactly what this institution needs. The first case that came across my desk in my new role was a doozy. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a prominent researcher in the medical school, was accused of fabricating data in several high-profile studies. The allegations came from a former graduate student who'd been kicked out of the program after questioning some inconsistencies in the research. Under the old system, this would have been handled quietly. Dr. Harper would have been given a chance to address the concerns. The graduate student would have been dismissed as disgruntled, and the whole thing would have disappeared. But now I had the authority to conduct a real investigation, with real consequences. Dr. Harper was everything I'd come to expect from institutional predators. Charming, well-connected, absolutely convinced that the rules didn't apply to her. She'd been fabricating data for years, publishing studies that couldn't be replicated, building a career on lies and manipulation. But she'd been careful about it, subtle enough that her fraud wasn't obvious unless you knew what to look for. The graduate student who'd blown the whistle was named Kevin Martinez, and his story was painfully familiar. Brilliant researcher, dedicated student, trusted his mentor completely until he started noticing things that didn't add up. When he asked questions, Dr. Harper first dismissed his concerns, then questioned his competence, then finally accused him of having a bad attitude that was incompatible with their research team. Kevin had tried to handle it through proper channels, just like I had with Marcus. He'd spoken to other faculty members, filed complaints with the department, even contacted the journal editors who'd published Dr. Harper's questionable studies. And just like me, he'd been told that his concerns were unfounded, that he was probably misunderstanding the complexity of the research, that he should focus on his own work instead of questioning his betters. But Kevin had something I hadn't had when I was dealing with Marcus. He had me. The investigation took for months and involved reviewing 5 years' worth of research data, interviewing dozens of current and former students, and working with external experts to verify Dr. Harper's published results. What we found was worse than I'd expected. Dr. Harper hadn't just fabricated data. She'd created an entire system for manufacturing false results, complete with fake patient records, manipulated statistical analyses, and forged documentation. More troubling was the discovery that Dr. Harper's fraud had real-world consequences. Her research on experimental cancer treatments had influenced clinical trials, affected treatment protocols, and potentially harmed patients who'd received therapies based on fabricated data. This wasn't just academic misconduct, it was medical malpractice on a massive scale. The university terminated Dr. Harper immediately and referred the case to federal prosecutors. Her medical license was revoked, her published studies were retracted, and she faced criminal charges for fraud and endangering public health. The medical journal that had published most of her work launched their own investigation and implemented new verification procedures to prevent similar fraud in the future. Kevin Martinez was reinstated in the graduate program with full funding and a formal apology. He was also invited to present his research at several major conferences, where his work was praised for its rigor and integrity. The experience of being vindicated after months of being dismissed and discredited transformed him from a timid graduate student into a confident advocate for research ethics. But the most important outcome was the message it sent to the rest of the institution. For decades, the university had operated under an informal policy of protecting prestigious faculty members from accountability. Now, for the first time, they'd seen that even the most prominent researchers could face real consequences for misconduct. The ripple effects were immediate and dramatic. Other victims of academic misconduct started coming forward, confident that their complaints would be taken seriously. Faculty members began reporting ethical concerns they'd been ignoring for years. Graduate students stopped accepting abuse as part of their education. The culture of silence and complicity that had protected predators for generations began to crumble. I realized I was witnessing something unprecedented, an entire institutional ecosystem being forced to evolve, to become more honest, more accountable, more just. And I was the catalyst for that evolution. But evolution always comes with resistance. The backlash started subtly. Colleagues who'd been friendly before became distant. Invitations to social events stopped coming. Research collaborations that had seemed promising suddenly fell through. I was being professionally isolated, not through any official action, but through the kind of quiet social punishment that academics excel at. The message was clear. I had become too dangerous to be around. My presence at conferences, on committees, in research collaborations, represented a risk that other faculty members weren't willing to take. What if I noticed something irregular in their work? What if I decided their research practices needed investigating? What if I turned my analytical skills on them? It was the same dynamic I'd seen with Marcus and Dr. Chen, but now applied to me. The system was trying to neutralize the threat I represented by making me radioactive. Too risky to work with, too controversial to support. For a while it worked. I found myself increasingly isolated, working alone, excluded from the normal networks of academic collaboration. It was lonely and frustrating, but it was also clarifying. I could see the system's immune response in action, the way it tried to expel anything that threatened its equilibrium. But the system had miscalculated. By isolating me, they'd freed me from the social constraints that normally kept potential troublemakers in line. I no longer had to worry about maintaining collegial relationships or protecting my reputation among peers. I could focus entirely on the work itself, without the political considerations that usually influenced academic decision-making. And the work kept coming. The more high-profile cases I handled successfully, the more people reached out for help. Victims of harassment, fraud, discrimination, theft, they all found their way to my office, drawn by stories of other people who'd finally gotten justice after years of being ignored. Each case taught me something new about how institutional corruption worked, how predators operated, how systems protected themselves. I was building a comprehensive understanding of academic misconduct, not as isolated incidents but as part of a larger pattern of institutional dysfunction. I started publishing papers about my findings, not just case studies, but analysis of systemic problems, recommendations for structural reforms, theoretical frameworks for understanding institutional corruption. The work was groundbreaking, but it was also damning. I was essentially documenting how higher education had become a playground for sophisticated predators, who understood how to manipulate systems that were supposed to ensure integrity. The academic response to my publications was mixed. Some scholars praised the work as necessary and overdue. Others criticized it as overly adversarial and damaging to institutional morale. Several journals rejected my papers, citing concerns about inflammatory rhetoric and insufficient objectivity. But the broader public response was overwhelmingly positive. Journalists picked up my research. Advocacy groups cited my work. Government officials referenced my findings in congressional hearings about academic fraud. I was becoming known outside academia as a leading expert on institutional corruption, someone who could explain complex systems of misconduct in terms that ordinary people could understand. That's when I realized I had a choice to make. I could stay within the academic system, continuing to fight corruption from the inside while dealing with professional isolation and institutional resistance, or I could step outside the system entirely, using my expertise to help victims and advocate for reform without being constrained by academic politics. The decision became easier when I received a call from Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Senate Subcommittee on Education Oversight. She wanted me to testify at hearings about fraud in federally funded research, to help legislators understand how institutional corruption worked and what could be done to prevent it. "We've been trying to address these problems for years," Senator Williams explained during our preliminary meeting. "But every time we propose reforms, we get pushback from universities claiming that increased oversight would interfere with academic freedom. We need someone who understands both sides of the issue, someone who can explain why current approaches aren't working." The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, and I spent that time preparing the most comprehensive analysis of academic corruption I'd ever attempted. I documented patterns across institutions, identified systemic vulnerabilities, and proposed specific reforms that would address root causes rather than just symptoms. But I also did something else. I reached out to every victim I'd worked with over the past 2 years and asked if they'd be willing to share their stories publicly. Not just the details of what had happened to them, but the impact it had on their careers, their mental health, their faith in institutional justice. 23 people agreed to participate: graduate students, junior faculty, senior researchers, administrators. All of them had been harmed by institutional corruption, and all of them had been failed by the systems that were supposed to protect them. Their stories formed a powerful narrative about the human cost of academic misconduct, the way institutional dysfunction destroyed lives and careers. The hearing was unlike anything Congress had seen before. Instead of the usual parade of university administrators offering vague promises of reform, senators heard detailed testimony from actual victims of academic corruption. They heard about research theft, sexual harassment, financial fraud, and data fabrication. They heard about careers destroyed, mental health damaged, and public trust betrayed. And they heard about how these problems were systemic, not isolated incidents that could be addressed through minor policy adjustments. The congressional hearing changed everything, not just for me, but for how the entire country understood academic corruption. The stories we shared were so shocking, so systematic, so clearly indicative of institutional failure that even the most education-friendly senators had to acknowledge that major reforms were needed. Senator Williams was particularly affected by Kevin Martinez's testimony about Dr. Harper's fraudulent cancer research. "You're telling me that fake research influenced treatment protocols for actual cancer patients?" she asked, her voice barely controlled. "Yes, ma'am," Kevin replied. Dr. Harper's studies were cited in clinical guidelines used by hospitals across the country. Patients received treatments based on data that never existed. The room went completely silent. You could feel the weight of that revelation settling over everyone present. The understanding that academic fraud wasn't just about career advancement or research prestige, but about life and death consequences for real people. My own testimony focused on the systemic nature of the problem. I explained how institutions had created environments where misconduct was rewarded and whistleblowing was punished. I showed how the current oversight mechanisms were designed to protect universities rather than ensure integrity. And I outlined specific reforms that would create real accountability. Dr. Chen, Dr. Harper, Marcus, these aren't isolated bad actors, I told the committee. They're products of a system that prioritizes reputation and revenue over truth and justice. Until we change the incentive structures that create these predators, we'll keep seeing the same patterns repeated. The hearing lasted 6 hours and was broadcast live on C-SPAN. By the end of the day, clips were going viral on social media. Major news outlets were covering the story, and university administrators across the country were fielding angry calls from donors and alumni. The response was swift and dramatic. Within 2 weeks, 3 major universities had announced new oversight procedures. The Department of Education launched a comprehensive review of research integrity policies. The National Science Foundation implemented emergency measures to verify data in recently funded studies. And Senator Williams introduced the Academic Integrity Act, which would mandate federal oversight of all institutions receiving government research funding. But the most significant change was cultural. For the first time in decades, academic misconduct was being treated as a serious public policy issue rather than an internal matter for universities to handle privately. The victims who'd testified at the hearing became public figures, advocates for reform who could speak directly to media and policymakers without going through institutional gatekeepers. I found myself at the center of a movement I'd never intended to create. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, speaking invitations, consulting opportunities. Publishers wanted me to write a book about institutional corruption. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell the story of how I'd evolved from victim to advocate. Advocacy groups wanted me to lead campaigns for legislative reform. It was overwhelming and exhilarating and terrifying all at once. I'd started this journey seeking personal justice for what Marcus had done to me. Now, I was being asked to lead a national conversation about academic integrity and institutional accountability. The book came first. The Predator's Playground: How Smart Institutions Protect Dangerous People was published 8 months after the congressional hearing, and it immediately became a bestseller, not just in academic circles, but among general readers who were hungry to understand how seemingly prestigious institutions could be so thoroughly corrupted. The book's success opened even more doors. I was invited to speak at conferences, consult with reform organizations, advise policymakers on legislative initiatives. I left my university position to focus focus on this work full-time, establishing a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of institutional misconduct and advocating for systemic reform. The work was more fulfilling than anything I'd ever done in traditional academia. Instead of writing papers that only other scholars would read, I was helping real people get real justice. Instead of theorizing about human behavior, I was changing the systems that shape that behavior. But success brought new challenges. The institutions I was fighting back began fighting back, not through direct confrontation, but through subtle forms of professional sabotage. My research was criticized in academic journals by scholars with undisclosed conflicts of interest. My speaking engagements were protested by groups funded by university donors. My nonprofit organization faced legal challenges and regulatory scrutiny that seemed designed to drain our resources and energy. The message was clear. I had become enough of a threat that powerful interests were willing to invest significant resources in stopping me. The first major counterattack came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Wilkins, Marcus's former mentor who had seemed so supportive during the ethics investigation. She published a paper in the Journal of Academic Ethics titled The Dangers of Vigilante Justice in Higher Education, which didn't mention me by name, but clearly described my work as extra-legal persecution of faculty members based on insufficient evidence and personal vendettas. The paper was a masterpiece of academic character assassination. It acknowledged that misconduct existed in higher education, but argued that my approach to addressing it was more dangerous than the problems I was trying to solve. It suggested that I was an unstable individual who had weaponized her expertise to settle personal scores, and warned that my methods could be used by anyone with a grudge against a colleague. The paper was cited extensively by other critics, creating an echo chamber of academic criticism that painted me as a dangerous extremist rather than a legitimate reformer. It was a perfect example of how institutions protect themselves, not by defending bad actors directly, but by attacking those who expose them. But Dr. Wilkins had made a crucial mistake. The paper was so obviously targeted at me, so clearly motivated by institutional self-interest rather than genuine ethical concerns, that it backfired spectacularly. Instead of discrediting my work, it became evidence of exactly the kind of institutional protection racket I'd been describing. Journalists picked up the story, noting the timing of the paper's publication and Dr. Wilkins' own history of protecting problematic faculty members. Graduate students at her university started asking uncomfortable questions about why she was more concerned with protecting alleged predators than supporting their victims. Several of her own colleagues publicly disagreed with her characterization of institutional reform efforts. Most damaging of all, 3 former students came forward with stories about Dr. Wilkins' own problematic behavior. Nothing criminal, but a pattern of favoritism, manipulation, and boundary violations that painted her as exactly the kind of faculty member who benefited from the current system's lack of accountability. Dr. Wilkins' attempt to destroy my credibility ended up destroying her own instead. She was forced to step down from several prestigious committees. Her paper was criticized in multiple response publications, and her own university launched a review of her conduct. It was a perfect example of what happened when institutional defenders tried to fight back, using the same tactics that had protected them for decades. The tactics no longer worked when subjected to public scrutiny. The failure of the academic counterattack only strengthened my position. It demonstrated that the old methods of silencing critics were no longer effective, that the culture of secrecy and protection that had enabled institutional corruption was finally breaking down. But the real vindication came 2 years later, when the Academic Integrity Act passed Congress with bipartisan support. The legislation mandated federal oversight of research integrity at all institutions receiving government funding, created protections for whistleblowers, and established consequences for institutions that failed to address misconduct appropriately. The signing ceremony was held in the Rose Garden, with Senator Williams and several of the hearing witnesses in attendance. President Martinez spoke about the importance of accountability in higher education, and thanked the brave individuals who had come forward to expose systemic problems that threaten public trust in academic research. Standing there in the Rose Garden, watching the president sign legislation that would protect future victims of academic misconduct, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. It had started with personal betrayal, with Marcus stealing my research and the system failing to provide justice. It had evolved through strategic revenge, careful planning, and systematic exposure of institutional corruption. But somewhere along the way, it had become something larger than revenge or even justice. It had become transformation, not just of my own life, but of the systems that shaped countless other lives. The smart people who had told me that intelligent individuals don't seek revenge had been wrong. Not because intelligent people are above revenge, but because when intelligent people do seek revenge, they don't stop at personal satisfaction. They understand that real justice requires systemic change, that individual victories are meaningless without institutional transformation. Marcus had stolen my research because he believed the system would protect him. Dr. Chen had tried to silence me because he believed the system would support him. Dr. Wilkins had tried to discredit me because she believed the system would vindicate her. They were all wrong. The system didn't protect them because I had changed the system itself. That's the difference between smart people and everyone else when it comes to revenge. Everyone else seeks payback. Smart people seek transformation. Everyone else wants their enemies to suffer. Smart people want the conditions that created those enemies to no longer exist. The most effective revenge isn't personal, it's systemic. It's not about destroying individual predators, but about creating environments where predators can't survive. It's not about settling scores, but about ensuring that the game itself becomes fair. Standing in the rose garden that day, I realized that I had gotten the ultimate revenge against Marcus. Not because I had destroyed his career. Anyone could have done that with enough evidence and persistence. But because I had destroyed the entire ecosystem that had created him, that had rewarded his behavior, that had protected him from consequences. Marcus could never hurt anyone the way he had hurt me. Not because he was gone, but because the systems that had enabled him no longer existed. That's what smart people understand about revenge that everyone else misses. The goal isn't to defeat your enemies. The goal is to make it impossible for people like your enemies to succeed. Subscribe for more stories about family betrayals, adoption trauma, and the devastating cost of keeping secrets. Hit the notification bell, because the truth always comes out eventually and it's rarely pretty.